We are now recording. This is Kubernetes Sig Docs for February 5th, 2019. Getting a bit of a late start with, I think, a fairly light agenda, but let's take it away. Do we have new contributors? No new contributors. Okay. Moving along, while I look for the meeting notes to share. Oi. Do we have announcements?
Yes.
I made it purposely vague, Andrew.
So I am switching my roles here at Google from being a tech writer to a program manager. And I will be working with Sarah Maddox on her Season of Docs project, which is to bring technical writers, pair them with open source projects to help improve the documentation and also give the technical writers some experience in the open source space. So that means I'm going to need to step down as co-chair for the Sig Docs. I'll still be involved here and there, but I won't have as much bandwidth. So I think probably the thing that makes most sense would be for Jared to then kind of swap back in as co-chair, since he was co-chair way back. So, but he and Zach and Jennifer can kind of figure that out.
Is there any way for us to veto you leaving? Is there a veto button? I'm looking around for my veto button. Jennifer, we got one of those.
Well, so I'm still planning to work on the modeling stuff and being part of Sig Docs. And I'll probably see you guys at conferences like KubeCon. But I just won't have the bandwidth to be like a co-chair and sort of lead the initiative. So I'll still be on the weekly meetings, I think.
Jennifer, look what I found.
What did you find?
Look at the video. Tissue box.
Oh, excellent. Sorry, the light's not great.
Oh, my bad.
Right, I might have. No.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Congratulations, grudgingly.
Thanks.
That is super cool stuff that you guys are doing. So, you notice that per other information that I have from you, Andrew, I'm a little bit vague about what you're going to be doing. And I'll be more explicit about it later, since these notes are completely public.
Oh, that's right. Because we'll officially announce the program on March 1st.
Right. So yes, awesome open source docs work in the minutes, but those of us on the meeting know just how awesome. And so the next item, as soon as we've recovered from deep feelings of sadness and found the tissue box along with Brad and wiped our eyes, follow up on mentorship from last week. So part of why the chairs have been talking about mentorship is knowing that we were going to be losing Andrew. Some of this has to do with what I guess one might call succession planning, but some of it has to do with working on opening up leadership opportunities to a broader group of people also. So Zach wanted to follow up on this topic, but he couldn't be here today. So I'm just putting this out as another ask to a somewhat expanded group from what we had last week. Inviting people to step up to shadow or learn more about leadership roles in Sig Docs, and contact any of the chairs for more information. We're making it up as we go along, but we'd love to bring some of you along with us. Andrew, did you want to add anything about mentorship?
No, just that I think it's a really great idea. Because when we were discussing the idea before, like always having someone sort of in the pipeline ready, like, in case anything happens, that would be great. Because then we can sort of have, pools of people that can, you know, be still have a leadership role ongoing, like, for a working group or something. But then, if one of the co-chair positions opens up, they could step in to do that. Or we can like add a co-chair position where that's, based on terms, is, have not exactly a term limit, but like maybe a suggested term length. Like, I don't know, it could be like, I think it should be based on units of quarters, since that's kind of our, our release cycles are based on that. So maybe it's like 3/4 or 4/4 or something like that. But just something so that people know what they're committing to. And I think that might make it more willing, because I know people have they have regular day jobs and may not have time for it. But if there's a more defined, I think, term, then that might make it a little easier to know what their commitment is.
Right, right. And the path to leadership doesn't have to be sort of a leap either. There are all kinds of ways you can step in and work. I mean, people do step in to work as pull request reviewers, sort of spontaneously on a volunteer basis, but then becoming an approver, sort of meeting with any of the regular contributors to the docs to find out more about how we do things to help document processes. Any and all of that work is very much related to leadership, and also work that we're happy to help you sort out if you're interested and aren't sure about what to do or where to start. And spread the word. So it's not yet 11 a.m. on the West Coast. And I think it would be cool if we could hear from Steve about his updates. I can report on the Netlify situation, although really there's no news except what's in the agenda, which is that the outstanding issue from last week appears to have been cleared up and the dev branch is good to go. Have you seen anything to the contrary, Andrew?
No, I still need to review it real quick today, but it looked pretty good when I looked at it last.
Yeah, I last looked at it last week too, but I thought things were operational now. Any items from anyone else? Speak up, please. Y'all are a really quiet group today.
For a little more cast on like the point and kind of run a task on it, and so I just want to revoice that and say that I'm available. But if there's concrete tasks that I can work on, I'm here to take on a few of them.
Hey, Chris, your call quality is really bad, and I didn't actually understand very many of the words that you just said. I just wanted to let you know that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm afraid that seems like it was on Chris's end, since it sounds like three of us had trouble hearing.
Ooh.
Sorry. It might have cleared up a little at the end. Do you want to try again? Okay, we can take a report in the agenda. It's open.
I heard you say that you were happy to help with something, so that's nice, but I don't actually know what it was.
You can type it into the chat.
Type it into the chat, type it into Slack, type it into the agenda. wherever you like. Anything else? Steve may not have to report after all. I mean, I think he's given us a good update in the agenda, and I think it sounds exciting. Maybe, Dominic, do you want to talk about the controller fact sheet? I, for one, would love to hear more about it if other folks on the call are interested.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, I can do that. So the controller fact sheets, the idea was taken, aka plagiarized, from sites you see, for example, Google or also Wikipedia. When you have a topic, like for example, you Google for a person or you look up a person on Wikipedia, you usually get a fact sheet based on the type, like for example, the type person. And the fact sheet gives you a few glances, like birth date, marital status, ex-spouses and spouse, occupation, a picture, what have you. So for our controllers, there is a possibility to include a fact sheet like that to get a quick glimpse of what the controller is, what it does, which object it reads, which object it writes. So for example, we could use scheduler as an example, or the replica set as an example. What type of controller is the replica set? The replica set is a core controller. It only reads and writes from the Kubernetes object store. What objects trigger the replica set? It is the replica set object. What objects does the replica set controller modify? The replica set controller modifies pods, can create pods, it can update pods, it can delete pods, and as any controller, it updates the trigger object, there the status. So you see that in a fact sheet for a controller, you can actually communicate a lot of information fairly efficiently, and it is consistent across all the controllers, because the controller pattern is applied over and over again in the controllers. So the fact sheet itself is fairly stable.
It sounds awesome. That stability and consistency across the different controllers seems like it's a really valuable thing from a user experience perspective.
Yeah, because then users don't have to think of them as totally different beasts and try to, keep all that in the head. If they know they all follow, a similar pattern, and then they can, whenever they need to reference a particular controller, they can just look at the fact sheet and just, they should get a good idea of what it does pretty quickly.
And also what it doesn't do, right? So for the replica set, again, if you want to understand the replica set, all you have to look at is the interaction of the replica set controller between the replica set objects and the pod objects, nothing else, right? Nothing else matters. No node object matters, no persistent volume claim matters, nothing matters to it but that. And the fact sheet would actually detail that out pretty quickly.
Any other items? Chris has indicated that he's interested in helping out with a getting started guide. If anybody else is also interested in that area of the content, just speak up on Slack, I think, and we can take a small working group sort of separately from this meeting to discuss what would be useful to work on there. And Steve has joined us.
Hello. Yeah, it sounds like you've discussed the notes that I put in there, and that Dominic has explained the fact sheet. So I think that's probably all I had.
I was hoping you would join us before we finished up. I mean, Dominic did talk about the fact sheets, and I invited him to do so to fill the time usefully until you could join us. Is there any more you want to say about the other topics or the rest of the content?
Just that I'm glad to see that these things are moving forward. The things we've chosen to work on as writing or updating content are happening. These are the ones that I'm involved in. So I listed these: the replica set, Cody's work on the ingress, and Dominic and I will take the deployment. Does anybody else want to report on any work they've been doing on the content updates or the writing of new content?
Well, there's a little bit in chat about getting going on the getting started content, which we talked about at KubeCon, and which I said I would sort of lead the way on, but have not, in fact, yet kicked off. But Chris showed up and said, hey, I was there and I offered to help, and I'm here and I'm offering to help. Yes, we will try to get that going, at least get a plan in place. And the one piece of content that I said I would work on is a better and better placed introduction to kubeadm.
Right.
Because right now you just sort of dive into it in the setup section, and there's some intro content in the reference section, and things aren't sort of where you expect to find them, nor do they really, I think, provide the right kind of top level picture of what you can do with kubeadm, what you need to be aware of, etc.
Now at the revamped Docs homepage, you could add, a card that was for the getting started and stuff, and put them together there. Or I wasn't sure if you wanted to create like a new section again, because at some point we did have a getting started like section, and then we deprecated it. So I don't.
Right. Well, we were calling it getting started, as I recall, at KubeCon in a very general sort of way, and my recollection is that what we're calling getting started at this point really is kind of a different but not unrelated wrapper for what we currently call setup.
So would that be an actual like directory and section, or would that be sort of a virtual thing, or that you just group content together for?
Yeah, a virtual thing, and it might not even be grouped differently. It might simply be different organization of the content within setup. Right, because we've been, this has been a point of discussion and some churn for a while now. And I mean, I think that was pretty clear in figuring out what the links ought to be for that section of the new card homepage, right? That's still not the greatest, clearest sort of entry point for setup. That card isn't, and that's not because of any problems with the card. It's problems with the organization of the content, if you see what I mean, sort of information architecture down one level from the homepage. And so I'm thinking that this is partly a new content and partly an information architecture thing, because as is so often the case, they're closely related here.
I'm wondering if we might want to make a distinction between getting started and setup, because now we have so many options for going through the basic ideas of Kubernetes and experimenting with them in these environments that are already set up, like the Katacoda and the other, I don't even know what they all are now, but there are ways of, embedding a shell in a page.
Right.
That might be what people think of as getting started, is help me just do a few things with Kubernetes so I can start building up my understanding. And we could treat that as separately from now, how would you set up your own cluster?
Right, right. And possibly, I think you're absolutely right, Steve. I was also listening to you. I'm wondering whether getting started, even for the sort of introductory get to know Kubernetes for the first time content, whether getting started isn't also a little bit of a misnomer, simply because historically, not in the world of Kubernetes, but historically, getting started helps you set up a sample project that you can then build on and keep building on until you eventually get to the thing that you have fully built and are ready to deploy to production, which is not the case with the kind of getting started sort of tutorials, exploring tools that you were just describing, Steve, which are important. I think they're really, these things might also help people understand better sort of a trajectory of learning Kubernetes, because it's one thing altogether to explore, deploying and deploying Nginx in some kind of a sample sandbox or playground, and another thing altogether to worry about spinning up your own clusters, so whether it's with a cloud service or on your own servers, with an eye to eventually getting to production. Those are almost two really different tracks, right?
Yeah, I'm more and more I'm seeing those as completely different.
Yeah.
Things.
Well, I guess all I'm doing is saying in more words what you said initially.
Well,
Steve.
plus we might not want to call it getting started. I mean, we do have a section called Kubernetes Basics that does do this very thing. And I think it does a reasonably good job of it.
Yeah. But it's worth looking at, it's maybe worth at a high level stepping back and looking at both sets of content to be really clear about how we present them as distinct. One of the things that I've also become aware of fairly quickly at my new company is what it means to learn Kubernetes if you're not actually worried about running the cluster. It doesn't mean very much at all, right? Your ops team, your DevOps folks, your whoever you are, if you're just worrying about developing an application, they spin up your environments and you go to those environments and you really don't care what's running under the hood. And yet I think we're still not as clear as we could be in the docs. And in these two places, this getting started or whatever we rename it to, and the setup content, that's a good place for us to be aware of that fact. Like, curious engineers working in a dev environment might want to understand a bit of what's going on under the hood, but they're certainly not going to want to learn about KubeADM, for example. Did that make sense?
Yeah. It's so varied. When it comes time to have a cluster, people's experiences will be really varied. Some will just push the button for some cloud provider's cluster, and that's that. Others, it will not be that easy. They'll want to create their own cluster, or they'll want to create a hybrid hybrid environment.
Right. Okay, Chris and Cody, we're going to think this stuff through together.
Awesome. Sounds great.
With consulting from Steve, I hope.
Yeah.
And anybody else. Everybody else, ideally.
Hey, so if we have some time, Dominic and I wanted to bounce off a presentation that we're working on. So now that we've been doing the modeling for a while and kind of like digging through Kubernetes, we've started to connect the dots. So we wanted to kind of go from a high level down to, where the components are. So we just wanted to sort of it's not, the presentation's not done, but we just want to go through what we had so far and kind of bounce it off all of you and see if you have any feedback or what your reactions are. Dominic, if you are.
All right. With, I emphasize the warning, it is not done at all, but I just gonna go ahead, share my screen. Oh, I cannot share while another participant is sharing.
Okay, you should be able to do it now.
Let's try this again. All right, can you see the screen?
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
So working title, Kubernetes in 15 minutes. And let me try to bounce off various concepts of you. So once again, this is not about the usage, right? It's not about the usage of Kubernetes in 15 minutes, but the high level concepts of Kubernetes in 15 minutes. And the first point is the introduction, the definition, what is Kubernetes? And commonly you find something along the lines that Kubernetes is a container orchestration engine designed to manage containerized applications. That is because containers take a very prominent spot in Kubernetes. However, I believe it is better introduced as Kubernetes is an infrastructure orchestration engine designed to manage containerized applications. And here, we're going to look at two different dimensions. The one is what is a containerized application, and the other one is what is an infrastructure orchestration engine. So for that, let's take a very simple, deliberately very simple model of what an application actually is. And for this model, one machine, so one node, we define an application as a set of processes, right? And if you explore the state space of a machine, state space exists of the binaries, so the application called binaries here, on the machine and the processes on the machine. And as a user, right, you manage applications. What does manage actually mean? Well, manage translates into a set of commands that you can send to the machine. So in that case, two commands would be deploy, you need to deploy a binary, and run, you need to start a binary so that you have a running process. Also in this case, it is up to you to monitor the processes. So if you have an application composed of 3 different processes, if one of these processes terminates in this simple model, it is your responsibility to bring this process back up. Now let's look at the first dimension, that is containerization. What is the difference between an application and a containerized application? That's actually fairly straightforward, right? Instead of binaries, we have images, and instead of processes on this abstraction level, we have containers. Yet you still have about the same commands. They come in somewhat different flavors, but the same commands. You need to deploy an image, which is usually done via a pull from a registry, so there is an indirection in there. You need to run an image to get a running container, and once again, in this simple model, it is up to you. Once a container fails, you have to bring it back up, right? And the question now, when we look at the dimension of infrastructure automation, is where does Kubernetes come in? And the interesting part, the interesting realization here is that Kubernetes takes your place, very much like in the early factories in an assembly line. There were actually humans at the assembly line assembling the car. Whereas then later on, a robot arm would take the place of the human. Kubernetes does very much the same thing. It takes your place. You tell Kubernetes either quote unquote what you want or quote unquote what to do. And Kubernetes issues these commands. The interesting thing here to realize is that Kubernetes issues the exact same commands that you would issue. It's like deploy the container. I'm sorry, deploy the image. Yeah, run the container. If the container dies, Kubernetes needs to monitor that and say, run this container again, right? Or run a new equal container. So that would bring us to a high-level overview of the system. Once again, not finalized, but a high-level overview of the system where we split Kubernetes in the control plane and the data plane. So here, the realization is that in the data plane, Kubernetes does not offer anything, right? The container engines, already there. The network subsystem, already there. Storage subsystem, already there. The load balancers, already there. Kubernetes just controls or manages the data plane, just as you would have done before, right? So while you speak the Kubernetes API to Kubernetes, create an object, like create replica set, update replica set, delete replica set, right? On this channel, Kubernetes issues the native commands towards the data plane, replica set, or in case of pod, to the container engine, right? So at the end of the day, I'm sorry for this being pretty small, so I'm still working on the graphics. That's interim. This is all about scale, right? For a container or a pod, Kubernetes takes a point or takes a viewpoint that you don't really care on what node it runs. I just need to find some node, and then I issue that command to that node. And then I need to configure the network interface. And I need to configure the storage manager so that it attaches a volume to this node, right? But once again, Kubernetes does not provide any of these services. Either your cloud provider or your data center provides these services. Kubernetes just automates the management of them. And management, again, for each of these components is a set of commands that Kubernetes can issue. The same set of commands that you could issue if you were to manage it manually. So then one little drill down into the Kubernetes control plane also reveals that Kubernetes has two different types of controllers that I just named core controller and edge controller in the interim. Core controllers are the controllers that read or query and modify Kubernetes object store exclusively, like the replica set controller will never touch anything else but the Kubernetes API server. The scheduler will never touch anything else but the Kubernetes API server. And then you have the edge controllers. And the edge controllers are the ones that actually make the change in the data plane happen. They read from the Kubernetes API server and then issue the appropriate commands towards the Kubernetes plane. Best example for an edge controller is the kubelet, right? It reads the information about the pods bound to this node and then issues the commands to create the containers, recreate containers, or bring the containers down in the container engine. So here as an example for the edge controller, right? We talk about the reconciliation loop a lot, but usually we only talk about 50%. That's we always talk about the spec, right? But if you look into like the infinity loop of Kubernetes, right? So you have the Kubernetes object store in its initial state. You have the data plane in its initial state. And then a user action happens, like I create a replica set or I create a pod, right? So the user changes the Kubernetes object store state here, like visualized by a tick, but as I said, it's very small. Yeah? So I will put the tick into words, but does not change the data plane state. Then the controller does the first 50% of the reconciliation. That is, it syncs the specification. It does not change the Kubernetes object store yet. It changes the data plane state. For example, bring up this container. So here, Kubernetes object store, tick, and the first change to the data plane state, tick. Right? And the second 50% of its job is to sync the status. Now it reads the state from the data plane, does not change the state from the data plane, but changes the state in the Kubernetes object store. So Kubernetes object store tick tick, yeah, to reflect the current state of Kubernetes. Sorry for that. Okay, and also that concludes the presentation as far as it is done.
So says the dog.
Of course it is.
Hey, Dominic, so another example of an edge controller would be like ingress, right? Because ingress is setting up or configuring the load balancer, right?
Network policy, yeah.
Yo.
Ingress is not a running thing.
Sorry. Yes, but so Andrew is right as far as I understood from the barking of the dogs. So ingress, yes. So if you look at, for example, the source code of the Google Cloud Platform specific ingress controller. So there, the ingress controller configures the load balancer that is already available in the Google Cloud Platform. Right? So in that case, for this image, yes, Kubernetes would configure the load balancers, or actually it talks to the load balance manager, the Google Cloud Platform, to get a load balancer and then configures the load balancer as to according to its rules, but as what is necessary. Yes. So the same is true for the storage system, right? So we have the volumes, and Kubernetes talks to the storage system, whether it's the Google Cloud Platform or AWS or Azure or what have you, or your own data center, to get the volume mounted on the node. An interesting now that we're at that topic, interesting point is that these channels are usually standardized, right? You can actually find the standard for it. For if it is the container engine, it's a container runtime interface. For configuring the network subsystem, it's a CNI, the container network interface. For the storage stuff, it's a CSI, the container storage interface, right? So the set of commands towards the data plane is actually standardized in the context of Kubernetes, and marks also a very nice clean cut between the Kubernetes control plane and the infrastructure. Also note in that case, right, the infrastructure never ever, or the Kubernetes data plane never ever comes in contact with any Kubernetes object. Doesn't know about any semantics of Kubernetes objects, doesn't know anything about it. It only exposes its API, right, its set of commands that is standardized via the different interfaces.
So I had some feedback when you're ready.
Anytime.
Sure. So I took some notes. So when you talk about the container versus processes, you got to be a little careful. One of the things that got lost in how it was coming across was, a container really is just a process that has some really cool Linux isolation security features with it. You've got your file space, your layered file space, and you've got other things. So the way it was presented, you talked about containers as images, which they are, I get that. But I always try and emphasize that it really is still just a process that has some nice features that isolate it with its own little file system, what have you, namespaces. And that's why there's the power of containers. They like a process, you can start them, you can stop them, really kill them, snapshot them really, really quickly. So if you could somehow capture that, I think it would help folks to understand how close those are. And then I did like, obviously, how you were talking about how Kubernetes becomes you. That was great. But the one thing that got lost was the power of Kubernetes and its declarative model. So it's not an imperative procedural in most cases. It really is a declarative model, and that gives you all the auto scaling and the failure resilience, the robustness. So if you could somehow make sure you emphasize that it's got a declarative model, and if the state changes from the desired state to what it needs to be, something fails, it's gonna start up a new container, new pod rather, what have you. That I think would help. So if you could make sure those key features that have made Kubernetes so successful, the declarative model, the built-in auto scaling, the built-in failure resilience, I think that would help as you go through the presentation. Obviously, I really do like what you covered, and don't get me wrong, I thought that was really cool, and it'll be very helpful. But I just want to make sure those key pieces weren't forgotten.
Actually, if you don't mind, I jump in on that too. So for in the perfect world, probably years from now, then find the time for that. I would also very much enjoy, like, for example, a section of inside containers. I understand that Kubernetes is an infrastructure automation platform, or container orchestration platform. Yet, I think it's an important part to understand the essence of containers. And yes, exactly, on an operating system level, right? The operating system doesn't know that containers exist, right? The reasoning, but I got that feedback before, so I need to work it in somehow. Okay. But the reasoning why I'm making a difference between containers and processes,
and you
on
should.
that level,
they're just kind of closer than people might realize. That's all.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The difference why I make or the reason why I make the difference is that on the level of container engine, the container knows what a process is, right? It has what a container is. The container has an ID. I need to use that ID in order to talk to the container, right? So from a user experience point of view, process doesn't equal container. From an operating,
and I didn't mean to imply that. I didn't mean to imply that.
Yes, I totally understand. Okay. From an operating system point of view, totally agree. Same thing, right? So that's why also this here, right? It looks like, the operating system manages a set of processes, right? And here it looks like, now the container engine manages a set of containers. If you want it to be actually very exact, you would need to put that into another thing here, right? And convey the fact that this is still actually managed by the operating system managing the processes. Yet so far I have shied away from it a little bit because it complicates the picture. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I have one sentence here so far. However, that sentence is terrible, cannot be used. Yeah. But as you see here in the user, right, there is, what does the user care about? I was also thinking the declarative state, right? Mm-hmm. Replica set, somewhat of an interesting example, right? It's like, okay, replica set declares, I want 3 pods. And it's like, again, from the point of user, I don't care. Yeah? So it's like replica set pod, I want containers. So the user has a desired data plane state, never a desired Kubernetes object store state, couldn't care less, right? And there is a data plane state. So now that sentence, as I said, this is like, don't use that anywhere. It's like the user needs to translate the desired data plane state into a set of Kubernetes objects, yeah? Such that the state of the data plane equals the desired state of the data plane when Kubernetes is in a steady state. It's a terrible sentence, but fairly accurate. Yeah? But yes, that it's like you're not giving Kubernetes commands, right? You're basically creating a representation of the desired data plane state within Kubernetes, and Kubernetes just works tirelessly to make sure. Yep. Which is still cool because this is kind of how a user works, right? If I have 2 nodes with a WordPress application, my desired state, WordPress up, Postgres up, or MySQL or whatever you're using, right? And then I work tirelessly to do that. Yeah? So it actually still lines up pretty well with this idea of, hey, I just replaced the user with some automaton and we're good. Yeah? Now
So
we're ready to scale.
Kubernetes is almost like the genie, and you're telling the genie your wishes, and it makes the wish come true. It's not like it's not like your assistant that you're telling exactly what to do. It's like you're giving it a wish list.
Correct. And the interesting thing here also to notice, usually I use the sentence, Kubernetes is a container orchestration engine designed to host containerized application. Actually, it doesn't host nothing, right? Kubernetes itself doesn't run anything for you. Kubernetes just manages stuff for you, right? On the data plane, which is all the stuff you already had in your data center. But Kubernetes automates that. So that's kind of the point of view that, or the angle that we're working on currently.
This is awesome stuff. It sounds like lots of other folks on the call think so too. But I'm never sure whether this meeting is 50 minutes or an hour per the schedule, but we're headed up to the hour. So if you don't mind, Dominic, if we can call that a wrap for now, and maybe we can continue some of this conversation in Slack or in other channels too, in the Google group. I think this is really, really good stuff. And any last items for the meeting? As Zach likes to say, going once, going twice. Sorry, you can't see me holding up my fingers. And that's a SIG meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Bye.
See ya.